Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking an objective, academic look at a highly controversial and, frankly, incredibly heavy historical artifact, Martin Luther's 1543 treatise, The Jews and Their Lies. Now, it is absolutely crucial to state right out of the gate that our goal here is not to endorse or validate the extreme and vitriolic rhetoric you're going to hear. Far from it. Instead, we're here to unpack it. We're going to examine it strictly as a historical document to understand the specific arguments a major historical figure used to justify his worldview. Because by breaking this down, we can really start to understand the deep, complex roots of historical rhetoric. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to navigate this material in 5 clear steps, starting with the 1948 publication context, moving through the theological divide and societal accusations, and then wrapping up with his advice to civil rulers and his final warnings.
First up, Section 1, the 1948 publication context, and how this artifact was resurrected.
Before we even get to Martin Luther's actual words from 1543, we have to take a quick detour to the mid-20th century. This specific English translation was published in Los Angeles in May of 1948 by a group calling itself the Christian Nationalist Crusade. They explicitly claimed that this was the first English translation to be published in the USA. And that gives us a really important anchor. We aren't just looking at a 16th century document in a vacuum. We are looking at a text that a very specific group decided needed to be brought back and handed to an English-speaking audience right after the Second World War.
The motivation behind publishing this is, well, it's incredibly revealing. In their own introduction, the publishers claim the text has been virtually hidden from the American people and that bringing it into the light promises to shake, shock, and alert Christian America. They are actively framing the release of this translation as exposing some hidden truth, using highly sensationalized language to really hook that 1948 audience. To wrap up their introduction, the publishers make a few very specific assertions. They say they're publishing this purely in the interest of historical accuracy, totally denying any partisan or sectarian motives. They even go so far as to claim they faced intimidation and interference just trying to get the text translated. Interestingly, they also go out of their way to warn readers not to view this as a uniquely Protestant issue. They point out that numerous popes issued equally severe edicts establishing ghettos. Neutrally speaking, they're trying to broaden the appeal of the text by framing it as a universal issue of historical transparency rather than just a narrow religious one.
Moving right along to Section 2, the theological divide and Luther's deep frustrations.
So if we strip away that 1948 introduction, what is Luther actually saying in 1543? Well, his whole text is rooted in a really deep frustration over failed conversions, and he leans heavily on one specific number, 1,469. He calculates that it has been exactly 1,469 years since the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD up to his current year of 1543. For Luther, this immense span of time is his ultimate theological proof. He argues that a merciful God would never punish his own chosen people with such a long, silent exile unless they were fundamentally in error. To him, that sheer duration of suffering is undeniable evidence of God's wrath.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Luther tries to weaponize linguistic disputes to prove his point. He zeroes in on the Hebrew word hemdoth from the book of Haggai. Luther argues it translates to desire of nations, which he interprets as a spiritual Messiah. But he claims that Jewish scholars deliberately twist this grammar to mean a literal desire for worldly possessions, specifically the gold and silver of the heathen nations. He basically uses this alleged mistranslation to accuse them of insatiable greed.
And this linguistic debate, it feeds into a massive theological divide over what the Messiah is actually supposed to be. Luther expects a spiritual savior, someone who conquers eternal death and grants spiritual salvation. In stark contrast, he asserts that the Jewish communities of his time were waiting for a kochab, essentially a worldly king who would bring earthly wealth, conquer nations by the sword, and establish an earthly utopia. Luther claims this fundamental mismatch is exactly why they reject Jesus, and he uses it to mock their faith as entirely worldly and carnal.
That brings us to Section 3, Accusations and Grievances. This is where things get highly societal. Right here is where the text takes a noticeably dark turn. Luther shifts away from abstract theology into some incredibly visceral societal accusations. First, he systematically attacks their pride, claiming they boast unjustifiably about their physical lineage to Abraham, while totally ignoring God's commandments. Second, he repeatedly accuses them of economic exploitation, specifically draining Christian wealth through usury, or charging interest on loans. Third, he accuses them of severe blasphemy, claiming they secretly refer to Jesus as a tola, or hanged malefactor, and Mary as haraya, or a harlot. And finally, perhaps most dangerously, he validates horrific historical rumors. He casually repeats accusations that they poison wells and mutilate children.
Just to give you a clear, objective sense of the sheer vitriol we're talking about, listen to this excerpt. Luther writes, "They are the real liars and bloodhounds who have not only perverted and falsified the entire scriptures from beginning to end." He actually goes on to describe them as the most bitter, poisonous enemies of Christians next to the devil himself. This language is quite literally designed to completely dehumanize the subjects of his treatise, and it sets the stage for what comes next.
Which leads us to Section 4, Advice to Civil Rulers. This is essentially a policy of persecution.
So the crucial point is that Luther doesn't just stop at complaining. Oh no. He actually provides a calculated step-by-step blueprint for civil authorities to enact devastating policies. He explicitly directs princes and lords to burn down synagogues and schools, destroy homes, and confiscate all religious texts. He tells them to legally forbid rabbis from teaching under threat of death, to revoke their safe conduct on the highways, to strip them of all their gold and silver to stop the practice of usury, and finally, to put flails and axes into the hands of the youth and force them into hard manual labor. It's a comprehensive, ruthless plan to destroy their religious, economic, and physical security. If you really want to understand the psychological intent behind all these rules, here's what he wrote. He advises rulers to take away their homes and place them under a roof or stable, like the gypsies. The explicitly stated goal here is humiliation, to let them know that they are not lords in our country, but in exile as captives. He wanted to completely strip away their dignity and any semblance of power or comfort they had achieved in society.
Finally, Section 5, Luther's final warnings and his absolutely unchanging stance. You know, a really common historical question is whether firebrands like this sort of soften up as they get older. Well, Luther died at 63, just a few years after publishing this treatise. In his final days, in February of 1546, he took to the pulpit in Eisleben to deliver his very last sermon. And his stance, it hadn't softened one bit. If anything, his ultimate demands became even more rigid. During that last sermon, while warning against what he called alien sins, Luther delivered a harsh ultimatum to the authorities. He said, "For that reason, you milords and men of authority should not tolerate but expel them. They are our public enemies." He basically abandoned that multi-step persecution plan from his earlier treatise and moved straight to demanding total expulsion. He told his audience he could no longer have patience with them, framing this extreme demand as the simple advice of a good patriot just trying to protect his country from harm. We have definitely covered some incredibly heavy, dark material today. But that brings us to a vital closing thought. How does objectively examining the historically charged rhetoric of wildly influential figures like Martin Luther help us understand the deep, tangled roots of modern societal conflicts? By looking directly at the source material, we can see exactly how theological debates were weaponized into devastating social policies. It's a really stark reminder of the power of words and the incredibly long shadow of history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive into a difficult text has empowered you with a much clearer understanding of the historical record.